Okay. So before we start, just a couple of reminders. Please mute your mic and make sure you turn off your camera for the duration of the presentation. And then afterwards, we'll have a question period where you can feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your camera again if you want while you're asking your question. So before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Micmac and Beothuk people. And we also recognize the Inuit of Natsiavut and Nunatuckavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful and equitable partnerships with all people of this province as we work towards true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Frederis Cyr. And Frederic has a master's from Paris Tech and Université de Versailles Saint-Quentin in Valence and a PhD, a PhD from the University of Quebec at Rimouski. And he now works for Fisheries and Oceans Canada, where he studies the climate of the Northwestern Atlantic Ocean with a focus on biogeochemical interactions. And today he'll be giving a talk called How is the Ocean Changing? Variability and Projections of the Newfoundland and Labrador Ocean Climate. So welcome, Frederic, and you can take it away.
Right, thank you very much for the invitation. I see there's 44 people. It's more than I expected given the weather outside. I'll try to share my screen. Okay. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, this should work. So thank you for the introduction. So yes, so my name is Frederic, and I'm a physical oceanographer for working for DFO. And today I will talk about how the ocean is changing with a focus on the variability and the projections of the Newfoundland and Labrador climate. Here, all right. So here's my outline. First of all, I'll talk what is climate and what is climate change. Then I'll give a kind of a basic idea of the functioning of the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. Then I will focus on the recent 70 years of Newfoundland and Labrador ocean climate, and I will give I'll conclude with some projections on the regional climate. So I'll start with some definitions. First of all, a definition from NASA. So climate is the description of the average weather or conditions for a particular region and time period, usually taken over 30 years. The reason we use 30 years is only a human construction. 30 years is the time of one generation. So it really a time scale relevant for humans. And then I would like to introduce two definitions of my own, if you want. The difference between natural and anthropogenic climate change. Natural climate change occur at multiple time scales, anything from interannual, that can be monitored with indices such as the North Atlantic Oscillation or the El Nino Southern Oscillation, to much longer time scale, for example, the glacial or interglacial cycles. The anthropogenic climate change is really what we hear in the news. When we hear about climate change, it is related to the human-driven imbalance of the Earth carbon cycle, to the release in the atmosphere of carbon, for example, CO2, previously stored in the ground for millions of years as fossil fuels. And the reason why putting CO2 in the atmosphere changed the climate is because of the greenhouse effect. And I'm sure everybody has an idea of what is the greenhouse effect, but I'd like to summarize it here from more like a physical point of view. So in physics, any body that has a certain temperature, imagine, for example, your wood stove in the winter would irradiate heat. And heat is a electromagnetic, basically a signal that will irradiate, and the irradiation of that body would follow a law that we call the black body emission law. So the planet is basically the same thing. If we look at the Earth from the space, the planet, given its temperature, would irradiate energy, and this flux that is represented here on the vertical axis, the energy flux on different wavelength or wave number in the infrared spectrum would follow this theoretical red line here, which is the black body emission spectrum. So that's the outgoing energy into space. Thing is, given the atmosphere, the different gas in the Earth atmosphere, there's departure from this theoretical law. And you see the effect of all gases in the atmosphere, and you see that CO2 located here is actually located almost in the peak of that black body emission curve. And this dent that we see here, it's all the energy that do not go into space, but stay inside the atmosphere. Sorry. So that's the greenhouse effect. The more CO2 we put here, the more energy that will not go into the atmosphere, but stay, will not go in space, but stay in the atmosphere. And the first person one of the first person who actually quantify that greenhouse effect is a researcher called Svante Arrhenius, who quantified actually the contribution of CO2 to the greenhouse effect in a paper from 1896. So we've been doing that for a long time. And since the importance of CO2 for the Earth climate, researchers have started to measure the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And one of the longest time series is from an observatory called Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And this time series was started by David Keeling in 1958. So what we see here is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in part per million, so ppm. And we see from this time series that between the late 50s and nowadays, we actually have increased CO2 concentration from a little less than 320 to a little less than 420. So almost 100 ppm put into the atmosphere in about 60 to 70 years. And just to, if you're interested by this kind of a sawtooth pattern that we see here, it's actually, there's a zoom on the right-hand side. It's actually the seasonal cycle. Because in the northern hemisphere, in the spring and summer, the bloom with the trees and the plants and the plankton in the ocean growing would draw the level of CO2 down, in which will be released in the winter. So there's the seasonal cycle, but if we smooth that cycle, we see a constant increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is known, this curve here is known as the Keeling curve. So we've been increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere by 100 ppm in a few decades. In the recent reading in December, we were at 414. But in order to understand, when was the last time that we had so much CO2 into the atmosphere, researchers went into the ice cores of Antarctica, because inside the ice cores, there are air bubbles, and inside these air bubbles, there's basically what was the composition of the atmosphere at the time these bubbles were formed. So going back, using this, researchers were able to go back in time, and they started by a 1,000 years in the past. And this study from 1998 showed that for about 1,000 years, so the past is on the left-hand side here, for 1,000 years, the CO2 concentration were basically constant below 300 ppm. And it started to increase around 1850 at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And then you see a constant increase that matches the Keeling curve that you see here in darker blue. So that was the first kind of evidence that of the role of humans into changing CO2 concentration into the atmosphere. Then again, researchers were interested to go further back in time. And this study from Monin et al. In 2001 showed the atmospheric CO2 concentration for the last 400,000 years. And what they've shown is oscillation between 200 and 300 ppm over the last 400 years. and in the recent period, actually, a dramatic increase. And not only they've shown this, but they can relate these changes between the glacial period and interglacial period. So when the Earth atmosphere had 200 ppm, we were into an ice age. When it's 300 ppm, we were into interglacial period. So 100 ppm change can bring the planet into or out of a glacial or interglacial period. And now we're 100 above that. So this study was one of the first one that showed that the mean Earth temperature is highly related to CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And then so on and so forth. Researchers were always interested to go back in time to understand when was the last time that we reached 400 ppm. I don't know if you know the answer, but in one of the recent paper from 2019, researchers were able to go back 2.2 million years in the past. And this is presented here in the middle panel. So I grayed out the other ones to really focus on the middle one here. So this is CO2 concentration since present on the left-hand side, back to 2.2 million years here on the right-hand side. And again, this shows that for 2.2 million years, CO2 varied between 2 and 300 ppm. So what will be the Earth climate at more than 400 ppm? Well, that's a pretty interesting question. And of course, there's a lot of very smart scientists working on this question with very complex numerical model. Here at DFO, we're a bit more humble, so we'll try to answer simpler questions, such as, will the cod come back into the region? So this brings me to the next part of my talk, which is a basic functioning of the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. Before starting, I'd like to introduce two more definitions. The first one is the definition of a climatology. So I mentioned before that the climate is usually taken as an average over a 30-year period. At the moment, this 30-year period that I use is 1981, 2010. Next year, I'm going to switch to 1991, 2020, when I'm going to look at the data from 2021. But for the time being, what is normal is defined as the average over that period, which is the climatological period. The normalized anomaly now is given by this kind of simple formula. So let Bx be any measured variable or time series. For example, the air temperature or the volume of ice or whatever. So x is my variable. If I subtract from x the average of that variable over the climatological period, then I get the anomaly. I get, for example, 2020 was, for example, 3 degrees Celsius above average. If I take that anomaly and I divide it by the standard deviation over the same period, then I get a normalized or standardized anomaly. This is handy because now this unit doesn't have, this variable is unitless. So we can easily compare different variables such as temperature, salinity, volume of ice, etc. So basically it works like this. This is the average temperature at a ocean station called Station 27, just outside St. John's here. It's a very long station since the 50s, we measure temperature there. So it's the average temperature top to bottom all year long. And what we see is the normalized anomaly at that station. So the climatological period, as I said, is this period here. And the gray band that you see is what I consider my normal. In this case, the average plus minus half a standard deviation. And we clearly see the different cycles, climatological cycle at Station 27. There was a very warm period in the 60s, early 70s that was followed by a cooling down that kind of peak in the early 90s. And then this was again followed by a warming up to 2010, 2011. And in recent years, we're kind of going back towards the gray envelope that is normal. So the climate is changing on natural time scale here. There's no clear increase of temperature at the moment. This is because we live in a naturally highly variable environment. And to illustrate that, I present here two sea surface temperature derived from satellite observations. Oops, sorry. So two sea surface temperature derived by satellite. So the first one is from the first week of June 2019. So just at the exit of the winter, basically. And the second one on the right-hand side is the last week of August 2019, which is the warmest period of the year. And even in the warmest period of the year, you see this basically in the color scale here goes from -2, which is roughly the freezing point of seawater in purple, to 30 degrees in red here. So even in the warmest week of the year, you see this very cold water close to zero running down the coast of Labrador and reaching the east of the Grand Bank here. And this water would go around the Grand Banks and flow on the Scotian Shelf and inside the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And part of it will be deflected offshore. And this water will at some point meet the warm water of the Gulf Stream and of the North Atlantic current that is kind of the extension of the Gulf Stream. So this kind of circulation pattern is part of a much larger circulation that is called the subpolar gyre. The subpolar gyre, so just to locate yourself, Newfoundland is here and this is Labrador. So the subpolar gyre is kind of this butterfly shape here in black. So it consists of the Labrador current here bringing cold water south, where it meets, as I said, the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic current. So the North Atlantic current here is the extension of the Gulf Stream that bring water towards Europe. And then at some point, this water will come back west with the Erminger current here, and then the West Greenland current on the west side of Greenland. And eventually this will loop back into the Labrador current. So that kind of gyre here is there on a permanent basis, and the waters circulate around it like that. And this subpolar gyre is driven in part by the mean wind pattern above the Atlantic, which in turn is driven by the atmospheric pressure. So this kind of map here shows the sea level pressure, so the atmospheric pressure at sea level in millibars above the Atlantic, average between 2015 and 2019. So the kind of purple patch here is a low pressure that is located at the moment in the kind of its mean position, and a high pressure that is located in the middle of the North Atlantic. And this pressure difference will drive the atmospheric airflow or the atmospheric jet stream along these black lines here. And my blue arrow here is kind of a very sketch of the air circulation in the North Atlantic. And this explains why it's when you take the plane from, for example, America to Europe, it's faster than when you come back because of this airflow driven by the mean wind patterns. The thing is that this wind, this kind of mean sea level pressure varies on multi-annual timescale. And I illustrate that here by showing you the anomaly of the sea level pressure. So basically the difference of between a certain period and the long-term average for two periods, I'd say two extreme periods. So the period 1965-69, where the low pressure that is normally above here was higher than usual by just a few millibar, by 3 millibar. The low pressure was higher than normal, and the high pressure, sorry, was lower than normal. In 1990-1994, the low pressure was lower than normal, and the high pressure was higher than normal. This means that the pressure difference here was higher, so it was spinning more the airflow above the Atlantic, while in the other case, the wind are still going the same direction, but the kind of the airflow will be reduced on average. And this usually brings warmer weather in Newfoundland in this case, because the airflow from the Arctic towards our region will be reduced, while in this case, we'll have a tendency to have colder weather in Newfoundland because of the airflow that spins more, so bring more cold air from the Arctic to our latitude. So since this sea level pressure change that will change the wind pattern, that will in turn change the subpolar gyre. And actually, in a recent paper, actually, there was an argument that when you have this case of figure, this will lead to a weaker subpolar gyre because the wind that actually spins the subpolar gyre is lower than normal. And when we have a higher kind of pressure difference like that, you will have a strong subpolar gyre. In a weak subpolar gyre, the Labrador current will have a tendency to loop around the Grand Banks and come west towards the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and to the Scotian Shelf. When you have a strong subpolar gyre, you have a strong wind pattern above the Atlantic, the Labrador current will have a tendency to be deflected offshore. And this will, of course, the ecosystem will also respond to these environmental changes. And I will give you, there's many different response of the ecosystem. I'll give you here 2 examples. The first one is from a paper from last year, from a PhD student at McGill, who showed that depending whether or not the Labrador current here can loop around the Grand Bank and bring oxygen-rich water towards the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or whether it's deflected offshore, this will influence the amount of oxygen that enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Because as you see, the Labrador current here will bring oxygen-rich water around the Grand Banks and enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence here. If the Labrador current is deflected offshore, then you have less of this water coming in, and the Gulf Stream will have a bigger space to get into it and bring low oxygen water. That's just one example. And this is also very related to a news that was in CBC last week. You might have seen it, that the deep water of the St. Lawrence hit scary highs in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is due to the partly to the same phenomenon. First of all, the Gulf Stream is warmer than usual, but if the Labrador current cannot successfully enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence here, but then the Gulf Stream has more space to go inside and bring more water, warmer water inside the Gulf. So this is the first example how the ecosystem would change in response to environmental changes. The second one is a work in progress that I'm doing with colleagues at DFO. Just by looking at it's very qualitative at the moment. So if you look at these several panel, this is the sea level pressure anomalies for different 5 years period, from 1980 to 84, then 85, 89, etc., until 2015, 2019. And the numbers you see here in green or red is the rate of change of capelin abundance, which is one of the key forage species in our region. So the rate of change of capelin, so whether in these 5 years the capelin is increasing or decreasing from our acoustic survey. And what we see is in 2 cases where there's a strong kind of dipole blue-red, such as the early 90s and such as the recent period. These are the 2 periods where the capelin is decreasing the most. At contrary, when, for example, there's red above Greenland in these 2 cases, when the airflow above the Atlantic is spinning a little less, when the subpolar gyre is weaker, then it seems to be good for the capelin that has been increasing in these two periods. This is, I'm not going to go further in this topic. This is ongoing work, and it is the closest as I get to the question whether or not the cod will come back. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of people that is working on that at DFO at the moment. So this will bring me to the next part of my talk, which is kind of an overview of the recent climate in Newfoundland and Labrador, even though I've already given some insights. But this gives me a chance to introduce the Atlantic Zone Monitoring Program that was established in 1998 Following the collapse of the groundfish ecosystem, scientists at DFO thought it was maybe a good idea to actually monitor the environment, because the environment could have played a role in this. In addition to overfishing, the environmental condition could have played a role in this collapse. So this program was introduced in '98, and every year, all the Atlantic region. So on this red line here, for example, you see our monitoring section. So we go on this section with the boat. So Newfoundland and Labrador is part of the program. Then Nova Scotia also do their part, and then the Gulf from New Brunswick and Quebec, they are doing the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And every year we gather together and we write a document that presents the oceanographic conditions in the Atlantic zone. We measure the physics, the chemistry, and the biology. And part of my job is to work on the physics in the Newfoundland part. And I will give you just a few words on the recent changes, but there's a lot more in the document I produce every year. And I will start with the North Atlantic Oscillation that you probably know. So the North Atlantic Oscillation is just an atmospheric index based on the sea level pressure difference that I presented at the beginning. So when this pressure difference is large, we have a positive NAO. We have stronger circulation in the North Atlantic. And this will bring, as I said earlier, colder condition in Labrador, in Newfoundland and Labrador. So the NAO was negative in the 60s, then positive in the 90s, and again positive in the recent years. So this positive phase that is ongoing since 2012 really looked like the one from the early 90s. And guess what? This corresponds to the two period I presented before. So these two periods where there's a strong dipole in sea surface sea level pressure anomaly correspond to these two periods. There's an interesting aspect that actually we just realized. It's a big but. January is just over, and actually the NAO index was negative for the first time, the most negative in 11 years. And now we're certain that the NAO average between December, January, and February will be negative for the first time in since the year 2009-2010. So I said it was in a kind of strong positive phase since 2012. Well, this year is over. Just have to look outside right now. It's almost 10 degrees Celsius. It's directly a proof of or a consequence, I would say, of this negative NAO at the moment. And if you notice, we had a very warm winter here, but there was snow in Spain, snow in France, snow in UK. So this is a direct consequence of this kind of sea level pressure that will drive the atmospheric current differently between here and Europe. All right, so as I said, NAO would influence the air temperature. You see it here by looking at air temperature in 5 places around the North Atlantic. So Nook in Greenland, Iqaluit in Baffin Island, Cartwright in Labrador, and then Bonavista and St. John's on the island of Newfoundland. And if we look at the temperature since the 50s for these 5 towns, and it's presented here in a stack bar fashion. So the total length of the bar is the average of the normalized anomaly for these 5 stations, and the relative length of each of the kind of color represent to the contribution to the average of each station. So we see that on average, 1972 was the coldest year, 2010 was the warmest year. The cold period of the 90s is pictured here. 2015 was another cold year. But we see this kind of pattern that looks like the NAO pattern. The average here is also presented in the bottom under the form of a scorecard that we call. This is something, if you look at the different AZMP report, this is something that comes a lot. It really presents whether or not, when it's blue, it means that it was colder than usual. Red, it was warmer. And the number here represents how many standard deviation above or below the average we were. So this is just to give you an example. So NAO would be a signature that will influence the air temperature, and the air temperature, especially in winter, would influence the cold intermediate layer, which is a key feature of the Newfoundland and Labrador ecosystem. And I illustrate the cold intermediate layer here using climatological data from the Seal Island section, which is a section here on the coast of Labrador, southern Labrador. So 0 here is the coast, 0 kilometers, up to 300 kilometers offshore. And the vertical axis here is the depth from 0 to 500 meter, with the plateau here on the shelf around 200 meter. And this kind of dark purple patch here, so the black line represents 0 degrees Celsius. So everything within that black line is below 0 degrees Celsius in the summer, on average. So you see, you can appreciate how important this water mass is for the system. It almost completely fill the Labrador Shelf here. It is formed in winter by atmospheric cooling of the water, and so because we generate a lot of cold water volume in the winter, this water gets trapped underneath another thinner layer that appear in the spring because of sea ice melt and because of the sun is warming up the top of the water column, leaving behind this cold intermediate layer. The thing is that depending on whether or not we have a cold or a warm winter like this winter, that will change the amount of cold water that we will have the next summer. And I illustrate this with two extreme years. So the climatology that I just presented is the bottom panel. The middle panel here is the CIL during the summer of 1990. So the summer that corresponded to the collapse of the groundfish ecosystem. You see how big and how cold that CIL was. And then I present the CIL in the summer of 1965, which was one of the warmest on record. And you see that the CIL was very almost absent from the shelf. And imagine any fish living on the bottom here would have a very different condition, something between -1 in 1990 versus almost 3 to 4 degrees in 1965. And guess what? This big CIL corresponded to this kind of a state of the sea level pressure, while this one corresponded to kind of the opposite pattern. So everything is kind of interconnected here. So we can kind of monitor the cold intermediate layer this way for 3 sections. So Seal Island I just presented, but also Buena Vista and Flemish Cap. And again, I present this in a kind of a stack bar fashion, where the total length of the bar is the average of the 3 stations. And what we see is a very, very warm cold intermediate layer in the 60s. That was followed by a cold one in the, well, actually, that's a warm because it's a negative volume anomaly. This is a positive volume, so it was cold in mid 80s and early 90s. And then we were again a kind of a colder period in 2011, but close to normal. So I can do this kind of parameter. I just presented the air temperature, NAO, and cold intermediate layer. There's all kind of parameters that I can look at. And I generally group these parameters into a single climate index. So here's my climate index. It's again a kind of a stack bar fashion where the length of the bar is the average of 10 different sub-indices. So there's the winter NAO, the air temperature, the sea ice area, number of iceberg, sea surface temperature, then temperature, salinity, and cold intermediate layer at station 27, then the CIL area along hydrographic station, and the bottom temperature on the shelf. And this really aims to be kind of an overview of the climate in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we can see basically this, again, the striking warmer period of the 60s. That was actually something that is never reproduced in the future after. And again, we can appreciate how cold were the mid 80s and the early 90s. And we can appreciate this kind of slow warming trend from the early 90s to about 2010. And this followed by kind of a cooling back to normal values. And the reason why I wanted to present this index, because it might be useful for you maybe in biology for your studies. So this index is now available online. There's a citation key here. You can download it, whether the average or whether all different field that is used to construct that index. It is all in normalized anomalies value, so easy to compare. And it's available on the FRDR, which is the Federated Research Data Repository. It's a Canadian repository. So there's a small explanation of the index on that website, but there's also a submitted paper in a journal called Earth System Science Data. And interesting with this journal is that the submitted paper are already available online. So even though it's not accepted yet, you can have a look and see how the climate index is constructed. All right, so this brings me to my very last part, which should be short. It's just basically a few slides. It's on the climate projection in Newfoundland and Labrador. Because I'm not working necessarily with projections, I will refer to two interesting reports. The first one is from the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who produced a special report in 2019 on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. So I really invite you to read the summary for policymaker if you're interested into the ocean. It's very comprehensive and very interesting. Canada has done its own report also in 2019. So there's the Canada's Changing Climate Report, again available online, and there's a chapter just on the ocean. And here I present some key messages that is kind of a mix between these two reports. The ocean has taken up more than 90% of the excess heat in the climate system. So I mentioned at the beginning, because of the greenhouse effect, we're keeping more heat inside, but actually 90% of that heat that we kept is not anymore in the atmosphere, it's already in the ocean. This heat increase, combined with the freshening because of ice melt, has increased the ocean stratification in the top 200 meters since 1970. And this has consequences on marine ecosystem. For example, more stratification means less oxygen going in, less nutrient going up in the euphotic zone, for example. The ocean has also taken up 20 to 30% of the total anthropogenic CO2 released into the atmosphere. I mentioned the Keeling curve, where we see an increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, but this increase do not match the rate at which we put CO2 in the atmosphere. This is because the ocean has already taken up 20 to 30% of that CO2. And this will cause further ocean acidification, which is another major threat to ocean ecosystems. The ocean has lost oxygen between 0.5 and 3.3% in the top 1,000 meter. This is because a warmer ocean can dissolve less oxygen, mostly, but also because of an increased stratification that prevent the input of oxygen. And then there's a poleward shift in the distribution of marine species since 1950. The rate given in the report is 50 kilometer per decade for epipelagic, so middle of the water column, and 30 kilometer per decade on the seafloor ecosystem. These number needs to be taken with care because it's based on the global scale, and for some region, the trend could be actually reverse, where Arctic species are going south. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at the North Atlantic Fisheries Centre and all the AZMP staff who works hard to keep the program running. I thank especially for this talk, Peter Galbraith, who provided me some data, Hannah Murphy, with who I collaborate with on Capeland, and Mathilde, who is PhD student, and Miguel, who did the work on oxygen. So thank you, and now I can take any question or comment.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank Frederic, and I think everyone will join me in thanking him. That was a fantastic talk. Very timely today on a 10-degree day in February. So I think how we'll work this here. I see we have maybe one or two questions already. But yeah, if you have a question, please just indicate that in the chat, and I'll call you out in order to ask your question. So first, we have a question from, let's see here, Raul, is that correct?
Yeah, it's Raul. Yeah,
Raul?
Hi.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi. Well, very interesting talk. Like really enjoyed it. Well, two questions actually. Is this talk going to be available somewhere?
Can I ask?
Yeah. Well, let's. Yeah.
I think it was recorded, but I mean, I can make my presentation available, no problem. You can email me, but I think it was recorded. No.
Yes, we did record the talk.
All right, thank you.
And it's up to Frederic.
All right. So my question would be, is there any, because you were relating the this index with several factors, but one that I was missing is chlorophyll A levels in the ocean. Is chlorophyll A and productivity in the ocean also linked in some way to all the data you were collecting?
Yes, it's a good question. I did not present it because we kind of split the work at inside AZMP. So I'm the physicist, and one of my colleague, David Bélanger, is the one reporting the chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is measured. We measure it in the mission, but we also can measure it from satellite. And yeah, that's a very key question. That if, for example, by reducing the ice cover, would like a year like this year, for example, that there's no ice, will the bloom be earlier than usual? In the Arctic, there's also sometimes a second bloom in the fall. So this is a very ongoing research question that I don't have the answer. But yes, we do measure it and we do report it inside the different report, like the report I mentioned, the ocean condition in 2015, in 2019. We do report all parameters of the bloom, the magnitude, the onset of the bloom, etc. So we monitor that every year.
And where are these reports available, if I may ask?
Yeah, it's available. Well, you can Google it. It's available without subscription. You can just download it. You just need to find it on the Canadian Science Advice Secretariat, CSAS. So if you type CSAS AZMP Ocean Report, you should be able to find it. Or otherwise, write me an email and I point it out.
All right, thank you. Because I'm going to be working with something puffin related this summer, and all this is very like convenient to some measures that I want to be taking. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for your question.
All right. Do we have any other questions from people in the audience? Okay, Cole, go ahead.
Cool. Thanks for the talk, Fred. I had a question considering, I mean, keep increasing our global concentration of CO2. Do we expect our windows of our anomaly indexes to get shorter over time, or what do we think we can expect to see from that?
Which anomaly index you mean?
Just, I guess, just the NAO.
So, okay, repeat the question. So if given we increase CO2 in the atmosphere, we increase the global temperature.
Yeah.
And you wonder if the index will
I guess
become.
like shorten like the time between our positive and negative phases.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, that's a very good question. So basically, the increase into the variability, like a faster. And yes, this is something that we seem to see. For some reason, the system was probably on a kind of a steady state with slow changes. And of course, it's difficult to extract a signal with such short time series on the global scale, if you want. But yeah, we seem to see an increase into the variability from one year to the other. We kind of switch back and forth, and this is also problematic for the ecosystem that cannot adapt to such fast pace. So I don't have a definite answer, but clearly what I seem to see in the data, and many people seem to see, is an increase into this variability. And also more extreme, like for example, this winter, that's crazy. Like we're into an extreme, and last year we were in a very cold winter. So
Cool, thanks.
All right, do we have any more questions here? Oh, okay. Any more questions for Frederic from the audience? Okay, Lewis, go ahead.
Hey, Fred, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, we've got this, what looks like potentially record low ice year, and all the impacts that could have on the whole food web. But in terms of the oceanography in particular, like what will that do to things like the cold intermediate layer? And if you want to speculate, what would that maybe do for the spring bloom? But I'm more interested in sort of the physical impact that this might have. Do you have any thoughts?
But for me, it's almost clear. First of all, we are in a record low ice right now. We're in Labrador. We're outside the envelope of historical data.
Okay, so that's confirmed, hey?
Yeah, this right moment, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I had I mean, if you're interested, I have I had extra slide with the sea ice at the moment. But so that's one thing. We're outside this winter, record low ice in the Gulf and in southern Labrador. And for the cold intermediate layer, I would bet on the fact that it will be very, very small next year, very almost absent. It will be there, of course, but yeah, it will be a year, maybe not such as 65 that I presented, but definitely a year where it's going to be weak. The thing is that there's kind of an inertia in the system. So imagine if you put a cup of water in your freezer, if you put warm water or cold water, it's going to be easier to cool down your water if it's already cold. So it's the same idea for the CIL. If it was cold from the previous winter, then it's going to be easier to cool it down more the next year. So a single year like this year might not be able to completely destroy the CIL. It will still be there. But if we had a succession of several years with a warmer condition, then it can almost completely disappear. And this is what happened in 65, for example.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts what that will do for the spring bloom then?
Yeah, for the spring bloom, to be honest, I don't know. I would guess that is going to be an early bloom this year. Because yeah, it's going to be easier to re-stratify the ocean. But no, that's speculative at this stage.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, no problem. Question from John Fisher.
Yeah, hi Fred. Enjoyed your talk. Thanks a lot for giving that. My question's about the I guess your original definition at the start, right? What is climate, and about the 30-year period, and about this these anomalies, right? So DFO reports a lot of anomalies, and yet the baseline period, as you said, might shift this next year when you're going to drop off those warm 80s and it'll start with the cool 90s and beyond.
Yeah.
So is there any risk given what you showed with the Mauna Loa curve and things going up and up and up, that this shifting baseline is going to change people's perceptions from one year to the next about current conditions relative to the past, if the past is always changing?
Yeah, totally agree with you. That's the risk. That's the risk. It's I think it's important to acknowledge that, and when we present our data, then I don't have a strong answer. I know for long-term climate, some people use longer period, but usually what we because there was discussion inside AZMP about that. And what we will do is the year we're going to change, we're going to probably present both or something like that. We're going to discuss what's the impact of changing the baseline.
Okay.
But yes, definitely it will change the perception for sure.
Because if someone just looks at colors, right, looks at red, blue, these sorts of things without looking at what's underneath, their perceptions could change.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Thanks for a good question.
All right, we have time for a few more questions, probably. If anyone else has anything else? All right. Well, if that's it, then like to again.
Let's go outside.
Yes, thank you, Fred, again for joining us, and yeah, let's all go outside.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, good luck with the seminar series.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.